Alright guys, so Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government broadly are absolutely steaming right now after the leader of the Senate Democrats here, Chuck Schumer, came out and gave a speech in which he was critical of Netanyahu's government and his coalition, and even floated the idea of having Israeli elections to replace the current ruling government in Israel. So there's a lot to get to here. I'm going to show you guys Netanyahu's response and a couple of other responses from some Israeli officials, so let's just go ahead and hop into some of what Chuck had to say here.
The fourth major obstacle to peace is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. As a lifelong supporter of Israel, it has become clear to me the Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th. The world has changed radically since then, and the Israeli people are being stifled right now by a governing vision that is stuck in the past. 5 months into this conflict, it is clear that Israelis need to take stock of the situation and ask, must we change course? At this critical juncture, I believe a new election is the only way to allow for a healthy and open decision-making process about the future of Israel.
Okay, so there's a couple things to say about that. First off, he did, in other parts of this speech, it was like 40 minutes, so I'm not going to show you guys the whole thing, but he did go into more detail and was critical of Netanyahu for years now being, completely openly opposed to even the mild prospects of a Palestinian state. He also talked about the expansion of the illegal settlements and a couple other things as well, so he was more specifically critical of Netanyahu, but I think it's important to point out here that when he talks about the Israeli people needing to have elections to potentially replace Bibi's government, okay, two things on that. Number one, the Israeli population does overwhelmingly despise Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, we've seen polls, especially in the aftermath of October 7th, but even before that, when he was trying to implement his sort of authoritarian judicial reforms, he had people by the thousands out in the streets who were protesting his government since October 7th. A lot of people think that he's largely to blame for the security factors or whatever that allowed for October 7th to take place, as well as propping up Hamas for years and years and years in an effort to sort of divide and conquer the Palestinian people. So the Israeli people do despise Netanyahu, okay, and I'm sure that they would be happy to replace him, but that's completely different from saying that the Israeli people or the Israeli government broadly disagree at a fundamental level with what the IDF and what the Benjamin Netanyahu government is currently doing in Gaza. That's a different matter, okay? The majority of Israelis do not believe that the IDF is in the midst of committing a genocide, okay? In fact, many Israelis, a huge bulk of Israelis, actually believe that the IDF should be doing more, okay? Keep in mind, this is already what is arguably the world's worst humanitarian crisis right now, okay? And many Israelis do believe they need to be doing more or they're doing about the right amount, okay? So it's important to understand the distinction between, having elections take place that could potentially replace Benjamin Netanyahu and distinguishing that from the fact that whoever replaces him likely may have some differences on their policy of genocide towards Gaza, but structurally is not going to change that much about the apartheid, about the illegal settlements, about the, IDF's offensive into Gaza. Maybe there's some disagreements and differences around the edges, but it's not going to fundamentally change what Israel is and what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. Okay, so that's an important distinction to make there, right? Now, another thing that I feel like some people just completely missed is that when he's talking about holding elections in Israel, he wasn't actually calling for those elections to take place right now. Okay, they have another quote here from the recount. He said, "I believe that holding a new election once the war starts to wind down would give Israelis an opportunity to express their vision for the post-war future." So keep that in mind. He's not actually saying like Netanyahu needs to be overthrown right now. He needs to be replaced immediately so that what's happening in Gaza can fundamentally change. He's not saying that at all. He's saying after Israel is done with their genocidal war on the people of Gaza, then maybe you could host some sort of an election. And that's important to point out here because the way that many Israeli officials were responding, they made it seem as if he was literally calling for Benjamin Netanyahu to be like immediately overthrown. That's not what he's saying here, okay? We also had this article that I thought was honestly just hilarious. This was from the Jerusalem Post. They said, U.S. is trying to overthrow Netanyahu's government, according to a senior Israeli official. So they say the Biden administration is attempting to overthrow Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government, according to this senior Israeli official back on Tuesday night of last week. He said, quote, "We expect our friends to act to overthrow the terror regime of Hamas and not the elected government in Israel." Okay, and this was in reaction to this annual threat assessment report which recently came out, and it warned basically in this report that Netanyahu's coalition could be replaced by a more moderate one. But here's what it actually said. They said Netanyahu's viability as a leader, as well as his governing coalition, they misspelled that I think here, of far-right and ultra-Orthodox parties that pursue hardline policies on Palestinians and security issues may be in doubt. Distrust of Netanyahu's ability to rule has deepened and broadened across the public from its already high levels before the war. We expect large protests demanding his resignation and new elections. A different, more moderate government is a possibility. So, to interpret that as if like the CIA is about to go into Israel and do a regime change operation is just delusional. That's not what this report is saying. What Benjamin Netanyahu has been doing over the last couple of years, or specifically over the last couple of months since October 7th, that is destabilizing, not just in the broader region, but also domestically for him as he continues to face protests, both again for his judicial reforms, and also his responsibility in regards to October 7th that many Israelis feel that he has, a direct responsibility for. So it's saying that his government could be destabilized, there could be elections that take place near in the future, and then after him, somebody who's less far-right and less extreme than Benjamin Netanyahu and Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, they could end up rising to power. So nothing about this is like a regime change operation going on here. It's a very mild report, right? It does spell trouble for Benjamin Netanyahu, certainly in his political career, but it's not some sort of like outside external conspiracy to overthrow the Israeli government. Honestly, if there was one instance where I may be in favor of the CIA engaging in a regime change operation, it may be against Israel. Okay, let's be honest about it. But unfortunately, this is not one of those times. And so I thought that article was absolutely hilarious. Now we get to Benjamin Netanyahu's response. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the first question here that Dana Bash asked him. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into Bibi here.
Of many Americans, they aren't criticizing Israel. They're criticizing you and your right-wing coalition.
Dana, there's a fallacy that is being perpetrated here. And you should take polls, you'll have your own polls, and check whether the people of Israel support the policies that I'm being criticized for. That is, supporting the policies of going into Rafah, destroying a quarter of the remaining Hamas terrorist army. That's like leaving a quarter of the Nazi terrorist army in Germany and saying, no, we're not going to finish the last quarter, and we're not going into Berlin. Most Israelis overwhelmingly support the position that we have to go in. They oppose the idea of ramming down a two-state solution or a terrorist state against their will, because they think that this will endanger Israel's future.
Okay, so you know what? On that one point, he's actually not wrong. Again, the polling shows the Israeli people overwhelmingly do not like Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership, but they do agree with what he has been doing in Gaza, overwhelmingly. That's absolutely true. And so I guess the main critique here that I would have, not only for Dana Bash in the question she was asking, but also for Chuck Schumer and many other Democrats as well, is that Democrats and liberal media pundits have basically conveniently used the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is an extremely far-right leader. His coalition is arguably the most far-right-wing in the modern history of Israel. That can be true, but they're using that as an opportunity to make this a critique of Benjamin Netanyahu as an individual leader, okay, or maybe Smotrich or maybe Itamar Ben-Gvir as a tangential part of that. And so in doing that, they are avoiding criticizing Israel, right? Which is exactly what her question was at the beginning of that clip there, right? People aren't criticizing Israel, they're criticizing your right-wing government. I'm criticizing Israel, okay? It just so happens that Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition is extremely far right and they are currently in power, but my critiques of Israel, they're not necessarily of the Israeli people, okay? They're certainly not of Jewish people or anything having to do with Judaism, okay? To swipe those anti-Semitism allegations ahead of time. My critique of Israel is structural to the state, the government, the military apparatus of Israel. It's a criticism of apartheid and occupation and illegal settlements and an ethnic cleansing and now a genocide in Gaza. Those are the four prongs of my critique of Israel. Okay, now, regardless of your feelings towards Benjamin Netanyahu, obviously I despise the guy, but he did not start that project. Okay, he did not create the apartheid. He did not create the occupation. Okay, So to make this a singular focus or a criticism just against him as an individual, you're making a mistake. And it's a convenient excuse for many Democrats who want to posture as if they're on the moral side of this equation, and that they care about what's happening in Gaza right now, and that they have disagreements with Netanyahu. It's a very convenient ploy for them to focus those critiques just on him and not of the state structural issues that are going on here, right? And so I think that that's an important point to make there. Now we also move on to a few other statements that were made in the wake of Chuck Schumer's, what I would say is kind of mild criticism of Netanyahu. They got here, Netanyahu responding in a different situation, saying it was totally inappropriate speech, calling for Israel's election. And he said, imagine after 9/11, if Israel had called for new U.S. elections or for George Bush to resign. Guys, I cannot even begin to express how much better off the world, certainly the Middle East, but the United States as well, would be right now if George W. Bush had resigned immediately following 9/11. I mean, we wouldn't have had the absolute disasters of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, these forever wars that are still trickling on to this day. If George W. Bush had been forced out, if there were new elections that had taken place, right? Now granted, if Dick Cheney had taken George W. Bush's place, if he resigned, that probably wouldn't be a better situation, to be honest. If, a right-wing, hawkish Democrat had replaced George W. Bush, maybe things would be relatively the same. Maybe we would still, have entered into those wars, right? So I'm not saying it would be perfect if he had resigned or been replaced, but it's hard to make the argument that things would not be at least marginally better if George W. Bush had resigned, okay? So to float that as an argument, to say, imagine if we had called for George W. Bush to resign after 9/11, you would have been doing us a favor. You would have been doing us a favor. And not to mention the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who then died as a result of George W. Bush's response to 9/11. You'd be doing a lot of people a lot of favors if you had done this. And so it's a ridiculous response there. We also had this from Naftali Bennett, former Prime Minister of Israel. He said, regardless of our political opinion, we strongly oppose external political intervention in Israel's internal affairs. We are an independent nation, not a banana republic, with the threat of terrorism on its way to the West. It would be best if the international community would assist Israel in its just war, thereby protecting their countries. So, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because Israel simultaneously wants to get billions of dollars in aid, in weaponry from the United States, from Europe, from the rest of these countries, mostly from the United States. They want to get all that money. They want to get our weapons. They want to get our protection. They want us to go to the United Nations in the Security Council and to veto ceasefire resolutions and to say that the ICJ and their case of genocide against Israel, it's ridiculous, it's unproductive, and it's meritless, right? They want us to do all of that for them. And then they also want us to have absolutely no say, no critique whatsoever of any of their actions, even if some of their actions may end up directly implicating us. I mean, we are literally bombing Yemen right now. We are bombing the Houthis, okay, in the Red Sea, because the Houthis went out and they started attacking ships to try to apply economic pressure to get Israel to stop their genocide in Gaza. And so now we are bombing a country for them, okay? Not to mention if this ends up spiraling towards a broader regional conflict with, like, Hezbollah, for example, that could also end up with the Biden administration deciding to get into that. Okay, not to mention that Israel has been trying to get us to go to war with Iran for years and years and years now. All of this directly implicates the American people. So the idea that we should not have a say as we're giving you this money, giving you the weapons, and as your decisions that you're making potentially implicate us and our foreign policy, then the idea that we don't have a say is utterly ridiculous. If you don't want us to have a say, then we're cutting off the money. Point blank period. We should have done that a long time ago anyways. If we lived in a just and a rational world, right now we would be sanctioning Israel, not giving them weapons, not giving them money, right? But I mean, it's just the audacity to come out and say that. Also at the same time, well, I'll save that other point for another video that we're going to watch here in a second. But I'll also mention this. With the threat of terrorism on its way to the West, this is something I've seen a lot from many Israeli politicians, pundits, etc., is that they're basically fighting the war against Hamas for us, okay? It's not for their own personal, it's for us, it's for the West. Because if they don't go in and destroy Hamas, in their view, then something Hamas and evil Arab terrorists are going to come to the United States and they're going to, destroy the West or something like that. Okay, listen, you don't have to like Hamas. I don't like Hamas. But you don't have to like or dislike Hamas to understand what Hamas's political goals are. Hamas, their political goals are not to establish like a global like jihad sort of apparatus. Their goals are to fight against the country, the state, that is currently occupying them, that has been blockading them for years. This is where Hamas came from initially, okay? Is they started out as sort of an aid organization, a charity organization inside of the Gaza Strip. They eventually morphed over years and years as the peace processes failed over and over again. They morphed into what they are now. But the idea that like Hamas has some sort of global ambitions and that they're a threat to me, they're not a threat to me. So why are you pushing this idea other than to just sort of further the Islamophobic narrative that all of these Arabs are the same? Hamas is the same as ISIS, which is the same as Al-Qaeda, which is the same as Iran, which is the same. They're just trying to blur the lines because their view of it is just they're Arab, they're terrorists, and they're a threat to all of you. So you all should be very scared, and therefore you should be scared into giving us money and weapons so that we can go and do a genocide in Gaza, because don't worry, it's all in the name of fighting this global war on terrorism that has been an objective failure forever, okay? And so I take issue with that framing there, to say the least. Now we move on to this. So this is an Israeli government spokesperson, Tal Heinrich, I guess is how you pronounce that. She went on Newsmax, because of course, and she made a really interesting point here. Let's go ahead and watch this clip.
Address what Schumers said there, these statements. Israel is a sovereign country. We're a democracy. This concept where the citizens choose who leads them, the government. And right now, in case someone hasn't noticed, we have a unity government in place. We don't intervene in American politics, and we expect to be treated with the same respect. The unity government and the war cabinet that we have in place right now, and the prime minister who leads them, really represent what the overwhelming majority of Israelis want to see, and that is a total victory over Hamas. We want to see all hostages back home. We want to see the elimination of this terrorist organization. We want to make sure that Gaza will never ever pose a terror threat to us again. And we reject the notion of a Palestinian terror state. Chuck Schumer also listed what he believes are the impediments to peace. When we talk about real peace, not just empty slogans, then the real impediments to peace are, Palestinian terrorism and their refusal to acknowledge that Israel is not some temporary entity and that it's here to stay. You'll remember very well that right after 9/11, when Osama bin Laden and radical Islamists attacked the United States, the civilized world closed ranks and rallied behind the United States. Right. And President George W. Bush back then, he said, it's either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. 20 years later, we asked the same question.
I mean, guys, this is one of their rallying cries, is we want to do to Gaza what George W. Bush did to Iraq. I mean, that's like, to think, I mean, there's like two levels of this. Number one is obviously the substantive level of, again, how absurd it is to argue that George W. Bush's response to 9/11 was logical and reasonable. No, it wasn't. The overwhelming majority of Americans don't believe that. So that's number one on the substantive point. But the second layer is like, do they really think this is effective propaganda? I mean, I maybe I'm wrong about this, but I feel like if you make the same arguments and use the same kinds of lines of logic that the George W. Bush administration used at the time to lie us into multiple wars that cost the lives of American soldiers and how many trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians overseas and all of this destabilization, if you're trying to use the same line of logic and arguments and even referencing that time period in American politics, I feel like the majority of Americans will look at that and be like, oh, what you guys are doing, if it's similar to what the Bush administration did, is insanity. Okay? So it's just a bizarre propaganda tool that they've been using. It reminds me of when, we hear them say like, well, somebody will bring up the level of destruction and the level of civilian deaths inside of Gaza in such a short time span. And they'll like, these Israeli spokespeople, they'll reference like, well, look at what the United States and the United Kingdom did in Vietnam and in Dresden and World War II and all of this. And it's like, those were catastrophes. Those were war crimes. After World War II, we literally established an entire new set of global international standards for how wars should be fought, specifically so that that kind of shit didn't happen again. And you're referencing that as if like that's a good thing, as if that's something that should be emulated and that you are emulating in Gaza right now. I mean, it kind of just gives the game away, right? So I thought that clip was incredibly interesting. Now, we also had this. Now, I'm pretty sure this is just a random pro-Israel account, so, don't go, getting into fights with them on my behalf or anything. But I also thought this was a funny tweet, to be honest. They said, is there any other country in the world that the USA dared to interfere in its internal affairs in such a rude and blatant way as it did in Israel? Just so good for so many different reasons. I mean, obviously, does this person not understand the history of the United States? Specifically, like, I don't know, let's just say post-World War II United States. I mean, over the last 100 years or so, we have either invaded or funded far-right death squads or backed up fascist governments or politically destabilized or, toppled the governments, the democratically elected governments of dozens of countries. So for them to think that, number one, the United States doesn't have that history, but number two, that the Biden administration, Chuck Schumer, coming out and mildly criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu while using none of the leverage that they actually have at their disposal in terms of withholding aid, in terms of condemning them at the United Nations, not using any of that leverage, but just mildly, rhetorically criticizing them. That is somehow this, rude and blatant interference in Israeli domestic affairs. I mean, it's just it's lunacy, guys. They are so fucking sensitive. Now, I'm going to finish off with this, because this is also just funny. John Bolton, of course, okay? The, obvious genius when it comes to failed coup attempts in the United States, right? Never seen a country he doesn't want to go to war with, never seen a government that is adversarial to the United States that he doesn't want to topple and overthrow, and John Bolton decided to chime in here. He says, glad to see that Joe Biden and his Hill followers embracing regime change as a part of U.S. foreign policy. Unfortunately, the regime that they're targeting is Israel's, one of our closest allies, instead of terrorist Iran's. At least Team Biden got the first letter right. They should keep trying until the spelling is correct. So kind of a weird spelling joke there that he got in about Iran and Israel, both starting with the letter I. Okay. But just amazing, guys. I mean, John Bolton, keep in mind, this is somebody who Trump had in his administration, okay? Don't let anybody ever tell you that Trump is like some anti-war peacenik, okay? In fact, Trump is largely to blame, I think, for October 7th happening in the first place, for emboldening Israel, moving the capital or the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, okay? And taking much more aggressive actions than even previous presidents had done towards Israel and towards the Palestinians. So he's coming out and he's basically saying the Biden administration is trying to do regime change in Israel. Complete lunacy, completely fabricated, pulled out of their ass. Biden has been doing basically every single thing that Israel wants to do. He's trying to currently send them billions and billions of dollars on top of the billions that we already give them so that they can continue doing what they're doing. He even went and decided to follow Benjamin Netanyahu's plan to build a fucking port, okay, off the coast of Gaza in order to trickle in aid, because he doesn't want to use leverage over Israel to force them to allow more aid through the land crossings. The idea that Biden has done everything that they want. It is almost impossible to find somebody who is as much of a hawk when it comes to supporting Israel and everything they want to do than Joe Biden. It's almost impossible. But John Bolton seems to think he's like some radical lefty. In John Bolton's mind, there is no difference between Joe Biden's policy on Israel and my, thoughts on Israel. He thinks like me and Joe Biden are like this on the political spectrum when it comes to Israel. Literally. I mean, it's just amazing. And obviously pushing, again, regime change in Iran, because that's going to go fantastic. It went fantastic the last time that we toppled the democratically elected government in Iran, right? That worked out perfectly last time. Not to mention the countless other times that we've done it around the world. So, I mean, listen, guys. Here we have another example of a U.S. politician coming out being mildly critical of Benjamin Netanyahu specifically, while taking note in many instances not to criticize some of the foundational aspects of Israel that are causing a lot of these issues in the first place, but mildly criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu's government. And then their statements are like blown out of proportion as if they're these radical statements that they're making here, okay? And then you have the Israeli government freaks out, tries to imply that we're attempting some sort of a CIA coup against Benjamin Netanyahu or something like that, and plays victim once again. So, I mean, the whole story is completely ridiculous. I think a lot of people are misinterpreting the extent of what Chuck Schumer was implying there. Again, he was calling for maybe once the war winds down, there could be new elections taking place. He's not calling for anything hard or serious. And yet it blows up into this massive thing. The entire Israeli government has to freak out and pretend. Now we got John Bolton, coming out and implying that the Biden administration is trying to topple the Israeli government. I mean, it's all just so ridiculous. And in the background of this, obviously we have Israel continuing to do what they've been doing. They just attacked Al-Shifa again, guys. Okay? They've been continuing to starve the Palestinians. We have had probably at this point dozens of innocent civilians who have starved to death as a result of this. There are more people who are on the category 5 or the phase 5 of starvation right now inside of Gaza than anywhere else in the world. In fact, it's at a historic level right now. Okay? We have almost the entire population of Gaza that has been internally displaced. Over 1 million of them living in what is basically a giant refugee camp in Rafah that Israel is planning to invade right now. With our weapons, with our tax dollars in our name, and all of that. And we get barely any pushback to it. Barely any. And what it is, it's just rhetorical shit. It's not actual policy shift. It's not using the leverage that they have in order to force Israel to fall in line. It's none of that. And so we have this catastrophic situation playing out in the background while everybody is talking about this stupid surface level, back and forth between US officials and Israeli officials who really at the, fundamental level agree with each other.